What's in our wallet? No doubt you've seen all the ads of Samuel Jackson, the actor, menacingly asking, yes, even taunting, his viewers with the question, what's in your wallet? The secret, of course, is that neither Jackson nor Capital One really cares about you, but Capital One does care about what's in your wallet, so that they might ultimately care about what's in their wallet. My question, though, comes from a place of biblical, theological, and pastoral care consequent upon Paul's care for the Corinthian church. This, our third installment in our series, Who is this church, shall answer the question, what's in our wallet? And I shall answer it with the information that Paul begins to offer the Corinthian church after he announces to them that he would not have them ignorant about spiritual matters. You might recall that we looked at Paul in his first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 12, when we began the series 3 weeks ago. So, like Paul to the Corinthians, I want you to know how blessed you are, Noah Baptist Church, along with the whole church. I want you to know what's in your spiritual wallet. And so our focus today is on the next 3 verses of 1 Corinthians chapter 12. And if you want to turn in the Pew Bibles, it's 1 Corinthians 12, and it's on page 174 in the New Testament. Here is what those 3 verses 4 through 6 in 1 Corinthians 12 say. Now, there are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit. There are varieties of services, but the same Lord. And there are varieties of activities, but it is the same God who activates all of them in everyone. So, what's in our wallet? Here's the fourfold answer. 1, the church is endowed with charisma. The church is endowed with charisma. The politicians have nothing on you. The church is endowed with charisma. The word gifts in verse 4 appears in the Greek language as charismata. And it is a derivative from the other Greek word charis, which you heard when Ed read from Ephesians 4 in verse 7, the last verse you heard. But every one of us has been given charis, grace. And here now Paul uses a cognate of charis, charismata, to define, or that is translated into English as gifts. What's the most common way in which people display charisma? Well, is it not when by their personal attitudes, when they're with somebody else or somebody's else, that they feel like they're a gift to you? They're not high maintenance, they're not onerous, they're not cantankerous, they're charismatic. They make you feel like you belong. They make you feel like you're a gift to them. Charisma. So you see, gifts, as Paul uses it in 1 Corinthians 12 verse 4, gifts communicate welcome. Like charisma, they communicate welcome, they communicate grace. Gifts communicate goodwill, unless it is Greeks bearing gifts. Friends, if the church is endowed with charisma, then in the church, what do you think? We should all be agreeable. Not necessarily in agreement, but we should all be agreeable. If the church is given charismata, if you, each one making up the church collective, is a member of the church and has, remember how the verse ends, verse 7, verse 7, that it is the same God, verse 6, sorry, it is the same God who activates all of these in every one. If the church is endowed with charisma, then we should all be agreeable. We should be agreeable when we see eye to eye. We should be agreeable when the process of understanding has not yet reached its terminus. We should be agreeable, in other words, when there are storms or when there are picnics. In other words, if the church is endowed with charisma, there should never be a time when we should not be in pursuit of peace and reconciliation. We should learn how to disagree agreeably. It means we should proceed with more questions than conclusions, with more inquiry than accusations, with quickness to listen and slowness to speak, with grace in our speech. Somewhere Paul writes, it might be to the Corinthians as well, let your speech be seasoned with grace. The opposite of taking a block of meat that you bought in the supermarket straight out of the freezer and chucking it into the oven and putting it before your guest. Insipid, tasteless, and offense. Season it. If the church is endowed with charisma, we should all be surrounded by and filled with attitudes that refrain from provoking others to disquiet. We might need this lesson on charisma earlier than we may think, so hold it dearly. The church is endowed with charisma. That's one. Two, the church is equipped for service. What's in your wallet? Well, the church is endowed with charisma. Two, the church is equipped for service. That's verse 5. The word service, I'm sorry, that's verse, where am I? I'm kind of mixing this up. It's verses 4 or 5, right? The word service is rendered diakonon in the Greek. It's the most interesting word. You recognize it in the English as deacon. And the most common idea associated with diakonion or diaconia or deacon is service. Service. It's the same word diaconia that shows up in Luke chapter 10, verse 40, where Jesus is a guest in the house of Mary, Martha. I should have named Martha first because there's a reason Luke names Martha first, and in fact it is Martha that invited Jesus to the house. In the past, I don't know if it is sexist to say this now, but in the past I used to say that Martha wore the pants in that house. And if you know the story well, you know that I'm kind of on solid ground even if I'm treading dangerously near to sexist language. But in that story, just a few verses 38 to 40, Jesus is in the house with his disciples and with other men. Mary and Martha and Lazarus are the hosts. And Martha is preoccupied with the preparations for hospitality to the guests. Mary is outside sitting with the men, listening to and partaking in the conversations. Martha comes out fuming from the kitchen. Master, don't you care for me? Tell my sister to get her. I don't think she said that, but tell my sister to come back and help me. And Jesus says, Martha, Martha, you are concerned about many things, but Mary has chosen the better part. The word that Luke uses referencing what Martha was doing in the kitchen was the same word, diakonia. She was busy with the services, with the preparations, cooking off a storm, bless her heart. And Jesus wasn't, impressed so much with that as he was with Mary, who had chosen the better part. Yet, he did not put her down for service. That same word shows up again in Acts chapter 6, verse 4, which many people regard, and I don't think theologically sound, but I understand, as the launching pad for the office of deacon in the church. When a problem arose with food distribution between widows of two different ethnic backgrounds. Oh, it's always an explosive thing when people of different ethnic and different racial backgrounds find themselves in the same space, and distribution of resources becomes a problem. The disciples smelled the explosion a mile off, and they said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to keep focusing on the word, but church, gather together and find yourselves 7 men. And, 7 men, yeah. But they could have found some women too if it was that time, but 7 men who are of good repute. And set them apart for this diakonia service. So what do you notice? In both the case of Luke 10 and Acts 6, the word diakonion that we have here in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. In verse 5, has to do with looking after people's human needs. Human needs. Not praying for them, which is good. Not wishing them well, which is good. Not thoughts and prayers, which is vacuous. But real help. James says it. You don't look at somebody who is hungry and say, oh my gosh, I'll pray for you, go be fed. Or somebody who's naked, oh my goodness, you're cold, huh? Oh, go be warm. No. He says true religion does something tangible about it. That's the word that Paul uses in verse 5 as he speaks about services. Services. And we bear that in mind. There are varieties of gifts, verse 4, but the same spirit. And there are varieties of services, diakonia, verse 5. So then, if the church is equipped for service, what do we find? Then we should all be caring. It means that we are all equipped to show concern for others, to help others, and to uplift others. All of us are so equipped. But to adequately do that for others, we shall need to become proficient in the practice of stepping out from our own selves, wherein we satisfy our own needs and preoccupy ourselves with our own needs, and then to address other people's needs. We're equipped. We're equipped for it. We can do it. We have the capacity to do it. But the only thing that stands in the way of us doing it is when we refocus that equipment, refocus that capacity onto ourselves and shut it off from others. We are all equipped to show concern tangibly. We have been given the spiritual equipment to enable us to do this, and to have the equipment that we don't use is the saddest statement of stewardship that one can find. So let us ensure that we are good stewards of these gifts and equipment. So my friends, what's in our wallet? 1, the church is endowed with charisma. 2, the church is equipped for service. 3, the church is energized with power. The church is energized with power. So as we did in verses 4 and 5, we take the key word, as we did in verses 4 and 5, and took the key words there and examined them in their original language, so we do with verse 6. And as we do that, we find that the word activities, which is there in the New Revised Standard Version that you hold in your hands, I have in the New International Version that I love to use the word working, activities, working. Those are words that you might recognize in the Greek. The Greek word is energemata. Easy to relate to our English word energy. In the Greek, the G has a guttural sound. Go. Energemata. There are different kinds of workings, activities. Energemata. Energy. It refers, what does energy refer to? I didn't do sciences in school. I kind of, bummed out on that. But I know something about impetus and kinetic energy and all. Energy, what does energy mean? It refers to movement. Energy refers to operations, action, work, working, energy. You can't work without energy. You can't move without energy. You can't perform any kind of operation without energy. Even as you sit there and think you're relaxing, you are using energy to stay up and refuse to lie down and sleep with all the space next to you. And if you did that, you'll be reclaiming energy to go do something else. I read a book which once said that energy, the definition of energy is storing up, the definition of rest is storing up energy for future rambunctiousness. Energy, you need it. The church, therefore, is not a group of spectators. It is not made up of some workers and some others who cheer on the workers. No, the entire church is comprised of workers. Every single member of the church has been given energy to move, to act, to work. There are tasks for everyone. Now hear this. If the church is energized with power, and if it means that everyone has energy, power to act, then it also means this, that the church and every one of us in it working together, activitating, if you will allow that, together, should be effective. For whatever else one renders as the definition of effective, it has to include the idea of purposeful movement that comes to a purposeful climax. A meaningful operation that is concluded successfully. So we must ask then, what is it that each of us is meant to be doing? And what is it that we are meant to be doing together. Together. Well, Tom can't be doing something contrary to what Harry is doing, and both claim to be supporting Dick and Mary, who also, by the way, are doing other things contrary to what Dick and Tom and Harry are doing. Tom and it becomes chaos. In an effective church, we may all be doing separate and different tasks, but each task is to be a directive of the Holy Spirit in accordance with the specific gifts we have been given by the wisdom of God, and we will deal with that in future installments down the road, God willing. And the Holy Spirit then choreographs all of these various movements into the harmonious and effective conclusion of the work that He should. So as I do my thing, it is not my thing, and I don't do it and say to you, you go do what you want, I don't care. No, whatever I do must be ready for the Spirit's joining with what you do, and I should therefore be listening to you as much as to the Spirit, and you as much to me as you listen to the Spirit, so that as we do our different tasks together, the Spirit, the same God who does it in all, makes it make sense. Yes, the church is energized with power. Let me make all that I just said to you make sense as I bring this to a close. Here's number 4. The church is enveloped with the Trinity. The church is enveloped with the Trinity. You will notice that in each of these 3 verses, Paul says there are varieties of X, but the same Y. Did you notice that? Verse 4. There are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit. There are varieties, verse 5, of services, but the same Lord. Verse 6. There are varieties of workings, energies, activities, but the same God. There are varieties, differences, the New International Version renders it. Differences, varieties of X, but Y. 3 times Paul mentions differences, and each time he follows them with the word but. 3 times Paul mentions the word but, and each time he follows it with a member of the Holy Trinity, Spirit, Son, and Creator. Did you notice that he did that also in the reading that Ed read in Ephesians 4? What Paul does in this beautiful and simple expression is equally profound. He shows how the entire Godhead that we refer to as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit is engaged in the church's life, is engaged in the work of the church, and the entire church is enveloped by and within God's total triune personhood